This is going to be a little different than the other recordings I've made. It may be of interest in undergraduate sociological theory students who are writing a paper analyzing a case of self-destruction using Durkheim suicide. And what I'm going to do in the next, say, 20 minutes or so is I'd like to walk through the 11 forms of consciousness that Durkheim uses or that develops in suicide, corresponding with 11 different sort of rationales or reasons to commit suicide, or 11 different moral energy currents that can compel the sane towards self-destruction. And I'm going to help you sort of differentiate between those in a shorthand way, and then and give some hints about how one would use this system to analyze an actual case of self-destruction, like what you're going to be doing in a paper. So let's begin. So what we're going to do, we're going to go. So this is going to be 11 forms of suicide. Okay, and so let's start with the basic four. Let's place egoism up here. And I always like to put the modern forms at the top, right? So this is going to be modern up here. And then we're going to have traditional down here. I've got to make sure I get it where we can still see it. So there's traditional. So you have egoism, and the other modern form of suicide is anomie. And then each of those corresponds with one of the double bonds. So there's two bonds that link an individual to society. One of them is the ego, of which egoism is the endpoint, is the bond of identification. Or if you want to do this, I always use noms, names, language. And the other is the bonds of regulation or norms. Okay, and so those are the two bonds. So again, every individual is sort of doubly bonded to society. In Durkheim's words, again, once through identification, through really a kind of psychological process of seeing oneself as identical with others, and the other through regulation, the structure that really controls more than anything action itself. So identification tends to be more internal. It tends to be again rooted in a kind of mental state, a kind of theory of mind is involved, whereas regulation really refers to conduct in everyday life. Okay, all right. So the opposite of anomie then is fatalism. And recall that fatalism is only talked about very briefly on page, let me see here, at the very end of chapter 5. It's that footnote at the very, very end of chapter 5. Okay, so again, we have the two modern forms of egoism and anomie, and fatalism, and the opposite of egoism is altruism. Okay, so now we have the basic form. So let's see if we can get this straight. So egoism is the is a kind of energy form that demands that one identifies as an autonomous person, as an autonomous individual, right? So there's going to be a kind of a moral imperative to identify oneself as a relatively autonomous individual, a kind of self-contained, self-bonded person. Anomie is a normative structure that demands a kind of absence of sort of fixed norms and kind of institutional rituals. And in Durkheim's writings, anomie often has a specific meaning in which the ends of life are out of whack or cannot be achieved with the means that are approved, right? So that the socially sanctioned ends of life and means to achieve them are somewhere out of whack. And there's that entire strain theory in deviance that is essentially an elongated an extension of Durkheim's writings on Anomie. Okay, so here we have, again, egoism is modern, where one thinks of oneself as autonomous, one identifies with one's own personality, essentially, where one separates oneself, at least psychologically, from one's family of origin, where you're not engulfed by by an overarching group, and where you really have a kind of mental space for reflection and for the pursuit of taste, and for the development of something like again, a kind of individuated set of talents and interests and so on, right? Okay, so that's egoism. Again, theory of mind, it's internal. Anomie, a lack of regulation. So anomie is typical of modern society, relative anomie, and because there's a kind of breakdown of the normal normative order, you've got an economic system that's often changing, you have an unleashing of desires and so on due to the spread of capital, right, and wealth and those kinds of things. On the other hand, you have fatalism, and fatalism is really a world of sort of total regulation, a complete absence of freedom. Okay, and over here, and again, that's tradition, and then over here is altruism, and that is going to be where one thinks of oneself primarily as you have a collective consciousness, and you think of oneself primarily in terms of a member of a group. All right. So the group comes before the individual, and egoism, the individual comes before the group. Okay. Now let's start looking at the individual forms within that. So fatalism is a kind of standalone system. So we'll come back to that last. Let's start with egoism, okay, which is where Durkheim starts. So Durkheim argues that there are two subtypes of egoism. You have Stoic egoism, and you have Epicurean egoism. Okay, so let's look at these two in turn. Stoic egoism is, in Durkheim's terms, it is a disease. Again, this is all about the disease of the infinite. I'll use the term that my friend Mark Orwell uses, that this is the realm of infinity disease. It's the world where there is too little society in the individual. This is true of both egoism and anomie. Okay, so in egoism, the Stoic is the person who is caught up in self-reflection. Okay, and the Epicurean is the person who's caught up in infinite sort of self. It's really desire, right? Yeah. Yes, I think that's right. Self-desire. Desire is over here, though. It's even itself. God, I can't. I'm embarrassed now. I can't quite get this. Well, this is close. Here, hang on. I have it somewhere here. Yeah, I had my sheet of paper, and as usually the case, I misplaced it. Okay. So once again, no one in the here. It's right here. Okay. Yeah. So that is the Stoic. Yeah. So it's okay. Well, I do. But let's use my terms, and we'll come back to this. So the Stoic is the person. Both egoistic forms of suicide have low energy, and that's contrasted to altruism. And all forms of altruistic suicide have high energy. And the idea is that the energy that fuels the self comes to us from society. And that if you're an egoist, you're relatively disconnected from society, hence you are cut off from the sources of moral energy which fuel even the individual personality. So this means that the Stoic is the person who essentially stops being the object of other people's desire. Okay? So stops being object of desire. So the Stoic withdraws from society, cuts other people out of society, by ceasing to be their object of desire. So to the Stoic, the only thing real is my own thoughts. The rest of the world is sort of discounted down, and the Stoic gets lost then in self-reflection. So they aren't engaged with the larger social order. They are instead essentially disconnected, and then again kind of wind down. So that kind of low energy, thoughtful, reflective, suicide, right? And again, in short of the ultimate suicide, you'd engage in self-destructive acts along that egoistic path. The Epicurean is someone who is in the world for pleasure, or for the realization of their own sort of interest, right? Their interest. So the Epicurean is the person who is caught up in so if the Stoic has infinite self-reflection, the Epicurean is the person who is caught up in infinite self. I'm going to change that. Let's just call it self-pleasure. Let's just leave it that way. So they're really caught up in their own pleasures, and that the world really only exists and is only important to them because it is the source of pleasure, provides them with pleasure. So the Epicurean tends to disconnect from the world when the thing that drives them out into the world, their desire, begins to wane. How does that sound? Old men who have lost the capacity to enjoy life, that kind of thing, right? Or a person who is who for whatever reason has lost whatever the means were to sustain their pleasure. Will because they're only in the world for pleasure. When their pleasure is gone, they don't want to be in the world, right? So again, a kind of slow, deliberate winding down, usually trying to avoid pain and that kind of thing, right? All right. So both the Stoic and Epicurean egoists are disconnected from society. They have too little society in them, and they're caught up in either infinite self-reflection, or I'll just use that term, infinite self-pleasuring, or something like that, right? It may not be the exact word. Use my other notes as the definitive version of this, but okay? All right. So that's on the identification realm. The next chapter that Durkheim deals with is the chapter on altruism. So this is the traditional society with collective consciousness and so on. And there are three subtypes of altruism, most of which are sort of already outlined in chapter 4 of the book. And so the first one is the obligatory. And the obligatory altruist commits suicide by duty. So this is the person. This is the the widow who throws herself on the funeral pyre of a husband. This is the military leader who has to do what will turn out to be a suicide mission, and they kind of know it, right? The men in World War I who crossed no man's land knowing that there's almost no chance of survival. Those kinds of things. So that's obligatory suicide by duty. All right. So again, kind of calm, resolute self-destruction. Okay. And usually, again, it's not for one's own end. You're not doing it because of pleasure, or because you've lost the capacity to pleasure. Instead, you're actually dying for the group, for the social order. So it is my duty to die. It is my duty, as I always like to tell students, the people who walked up the stairs of the 9/11 catastrophe at the World Trade Center, those people who were going up the stairs while everyone else was coming down, probably had a fair idea that they weren't coming out of this alive, and just knew it was their duty, their job to do it, and they're going to do their job. So they went to their death as a duty. It was an obligatory suicide. Okay. The next one is the optional. So the optional altruist is the person who yeah. So to me, the altruist then is the person who has, again, kind of like too much society in the individual. I just dripped ink here. Too much society in the individual. So they're getting moral commands, and what the society is telling him is to die for me, right? Go die for me. And so the altruist, the obligatory altruist, simply knows that it's their duty to die, right? What does the big other wanted me? The bigger other wants me to fulfill my duty in my calling, or the duty in my my family, whatever it is, and my duty is to die, right? So you listen to the call of the big other, and you're dying for the big other. The optional altruist, there's all those weird cases he writes about. One of them is the person who's been dishonored and who takes the gentleman's way out, with the idea that if you don't drag your name and your family through a trial, but instead just kill yourself, you can preserve your family name and your children won't be as dishonored as they would be if a trial or something would occur, right? So this often happens in British detective fiction. The other example that he writes about is the Dakota woman who had too little, so they really had no self, right? No individual self. That in an altruistic society where you don't develop much of an individual self, if the big other doesn't need you anymore, you don't have any reason to live. So there was the case of the mother, the widowed mother of a man who was married and whose wife took over care of him, and so she went out and attempted suicide. I'm not sure she actually successfully did it, but she did it not really out of any anger. It's just that the big other didn't want her. So she listened to the big other. What does the big other want of me? And the answer was, we don't need you anymore. And so since there wasn't enough individual self, like Epicurean desire or Stoic desire, you just sort of, die. So, and then the other case that he writes about are like people playing Russian roulette. You're doing it to get some little jazzy piece of honor. People are going to think you're cool after you're dead. You're willing to sacrifice the body to get a trophy, basically, right? To die for a trophy, to die for a trophy. So this would be the person who volunteers to go on a suicide mission, right? You're doing it in order to get, the daredevil status. People who do extreme sports might be doing something like that too. Okay, and then the last case is the mystic enthusiasm. So, this is the people who throw themselves under the juggernaut, the people who light themselves on fire, the warriors who run off into battle saying it's a good day to die, that kind of thing, right? Again, listening to the call of the big other, and the big other says, die with enthusiasm, and it's this rush to reunite with the big other in death, right? So that's those three, right? So in all three of these cases, it is the individual's desire, their soul's deepest desire, to reunite with the big other. And, the moment arises when one does it, either through duty, through an optional effort to make a trophy of one's carcass in order to live on forever in the symbolic order, or through the mystic enthusiasm, which is really that longing, that enthusiastic, high-energy longing. So his claim is that these suicides tend to have energy involved in them, right? Especially the mystic enthusiasm, and that again, you might do it as duty, kind of resolve. There's going to be energy involved. Okay. All right. The next chapter that he deals with is anomie, and there's going to be we should list these. So we have type 1, type 2, type 3, type 4, type 5, and now we're up to type 6 and 7, and it's specific anomie and it's general anomie. So the anomic person is the person who's unable to stabilize their object of desire, and they're unable to realize their desire. So these are people who suffer from infinite desire, right? This is self-reflection and self-pleasure. This is infinite desire, right? So it's infinity disease. Desire has been unleashed, and you can't figure out a way to get there. And so, there's two forms of that: the exasperation due to a specific person who seems to get in your way and not allow you to achieve your desired end, and the other is the general, where it's society as a whole. So here you're aggrieved, exasperated. I think his term is violent. Um, isn't it violent? Yeah, violent recrimination is his term for this. So you're always angry and going to die, kill. So anytime you're killing someone else, it's a murder suicide. There's almost always an anomic component. You're mad, you're angry, and you're going to take someone down with you, right? Okay, so that's those two. There's a specific individual or a specific category of person that you can identify, right? The San Bernardino shooter, angry at women for not dating him, angry at women, he goes out and shoots women, right? General, you just climb the tower like the famous guy did in Texas back in the 60s, and just get out a rifle and start shooting people at random. Or the person that did that shooting at Las Vegas, right, a few years back, that shot 400 people, and that huge number of people died. Um, um, so the specific, the Orlando shooting, right, at the gay nightclub. It was that homophobe who went and shot, targeted gay people. That would be specific, a specific category. General, like the Las Vegas shooter who just went out and just shot everyone. Okay, so now we're up to 7. Then we have fatalism. That's going to be number 8. So fatalism is where you have the failure to desire due to infinite demands. And this is, this is infinite what? So this is altruism, infinite call to die, and this would be infinite demands. So you have an infinite demand placed upon you. You're completely regulated. You have no ability to stage desire, right? So you're dying because you can't realize desire. You can't even stage it, right? You're completely locked into a regulatory system. So I think this would explain at least some of the deaths in like the Foxconn plant in China, where people leapt. Yeah, we were just mentioning fatalism, and in fatalism, again, you're unable to stage desire because the demands of the big other are so overwhelming that you can't even do it. So in Durkheim's writings, he wrote about, like the very young men who had sexual desire, married very young, and then found themselves locked into a relatively pleasureless existence with the need to earn money and that kind of thing, right? That was his rather sexist explanation for the high suicide rates of married young men that exceeded the suicide rates for single young men. I think better examples are slaves, or people who fall into debt slavery, or people who, I think that, like I was mentioning, the Foxconn workers in China who jump out the windows because they're basically working all the time, and all of the income that they make went to pay the housing to work there, right? So you're basically locked into a factory system where you can't get out of it, where all of your life is being absorbed. In other words, life is like a gulag, a work camp, right? And that would be fatalism, right? You're unable to even stage desire because your life is completely regulated and controlled. You have no freedom, right? Okay, so that's fatalism, number 8. All right, so now we have 3 compound forms. So that's all of the individual forms. Now we have 3 compound forms. And these are listed by Durkheim. He writes about them in the end of the chapter. And again, all of what we're doing is sort of listed here on page 293, where you get this really nice sort of summary table of these different forms. So the first one, so the mixed type, as he calls them, we're going to call them compound forms, is egoinomic. All right, so egoinomic suicide we'll put it right here. So this is egoinomic. And so that's going to be type 9. Okay, so egoinomic is going to be a very, very modern form of suicide, because it's going to combine autonomous individuality with infinite desire. So you're going to have infinite self-reflection or infinite self-pleasuring coupled with infinite desire in a world that lacks a kind of good regulated means ends, right? So you don't really have good regulatory structure to achieve what you desire, and you're also an autonomous individual cut off from social support and from from identification with others. And so the way Durkheim describes that is that kind of bipolarity, where you shift back and forth between, again, kind of reaching out to others, and then you find the world to be anomic. You get injured, traumatized, right? Because this is always a traumatic form of consciousness. And then you're coming back in egoism, probably Stoic egoism, licking your wounds, going back out again and trying, coming back, failing, coming back and licking your wounds again. And so you get kind of this bipolarity of attempting, failing, coming back, attempting, failing. And he claims it tends to escalate like that. He calls this one of the most unhappy forms of consciousness one can have. And again, it would lead to, his term is, it's a mixture of agitation and apathy, of action and reverie. right? And so again, so you get really, really frustrated, you get damaged and bruised, and you're unable to realize desires and get lost, in the sense of being a failure and so on. Okay, so so it's that combination form. The next one is anomic altruistic suicide. Okay, so that's here. So it's not. So we're over here. So we'll put it right here. So this is number 10. So this is anomic altruistic. Okay. Now, just like ego anomic, this is going to have a lot of violence built into it, right? Because the anomic is always angry, violent recrimination. So here it's this egoistic self-withdrawal coupled with angry recrimination, right? So there's going to be a lot of energy again, and a lot of anger and a lot of violence, and often again murder going along with suicide. In anomic altruism, you're going to get the same thing. You're going to get a lot of violence. So what is anomic altruism? Well, he calls it the suicide of the besieged. So this is where you're attached to a big other, an altruistic big other, a group, a cause, a party that is under siege, that's beginning to fall apart, that's beginning to deregulate or dysregulate. And so you're often, again, violent and angry about some enemy that's causing your group that you love so much to fall apart, but you remain altruistically tied to your group. So you get all of the energy of altruism, high energy, coupled with all of the violence and the recrimination of anomie. You get all of this sort of high moral temperature. You feel really justified and moral here, coupled with the violence of this. So again, I think a lot of suicide bombers are going to fit into this category, especially if you're doing it for a cause. People who get involved in violent movements, you're doing it for a cause. The Nazis, as depicted in the great film Downfall, were all killing each other as their system fell apart. The other day when I was talking with students in the discussion, again, this is weeks before the election. There's a lot of talk right now about fear of what happens if Donald Trump is indeed defeated. What will Trump's loyal following do? They're attached to a leader and to a cause that has undergone demise, right? If it indeed loses, then they're going to be feeling that violent recrimination against enemies. So who are the enemies going to be? Probably the people responsible for the downfall of their hero. And so then you could wind up with this very high energy, very violent, anomic, altruistic suicide, and then acts of self-destruction short of suicide. So we could have a lot of violence in the wake of that. Okay, like a suicide bomber would fit this. Okay, now the last compound form he calls ego altruism. So ego altruism would actually lie like either above or underneath, because it's a combination of egoism and altruism. So these are two things that normally don't go together. So we'll put number 10 right there. So it's egoistic altruism. Okay, so what's that one? So that's the form of suicide where you have a person who is egoistically disconnected from the actual living people around them, right? Where they have actually severed their network of social ties or damaged their network of social ties because they're very self-focused, self-reflective, or self-pleasuring in some way. They're cut off from the people around them. So the others in their actual world don't matter to them, only they do. So you have that kind of winding down and sort of calmness and alienation of the person who's cut off from the moral temperature of altruism. But you also have the high moral temperature and the high sense of purpose of altruism. But the problem is that the altruistic side, the group that you're attached to, is sort of unreal in some way. It is distant. It is idealistic in some way. So let's say that you're a member of a cause, you've joined a cause, a religious group, a cult of some kind maybe, a following, a radicalized following of some kind, or you've been radicalized online, either as a white supremacist here in America, or as an activist elsewhere. You've been radicalized, so you're really, really committed to a cause, but the people who have activated you, recruited you, and even radicalized you aren't nearby. So you're very, very attached to people who aren't in your immediate world of social contacts, or don't constitute the majority of them, and you're disconnected from the immediate world around you. So you're egoistically withdrawn from the world around you and altruistically tied to some great others out there. And again, I think this can be, again, suicide bombers and, again, like people acting for a cause. But here it's going to be, in anomic altruism, you're going to be engaged in these acts of violence because the world is falling apart in some way. Here, you're going to be engaged in acts of violence because you've been commanded to do so by the big other. So here it's more of an individual choice, demand that seems to be a response to the recriminations to enemies who are causing the disintegration of your group. Here in number 11, you're egoistically committed, cut off from people, tied to a group that's commanding you to do violence probably towards those who are near and dear. It could be towards a distant person as well. Okay? So there's egoistic altruism. So there's the 11 forms, okay? So Stoic egoism, number 1. Epicurean egoism, number 2. Then we drop down here, obligatory altruism. Number 4 was optional altruism. Number 5 was mystic enthusiastic altruism. Number 6 was specific anomie. 7, general anomie. 8 was fatalism. 9 was, egoistic altruism was number 9. Egoistic anomie was number 9. Number 10 was anomic altruism. And then ego altruism was number 11. Okay, so there's the forms. Okay, so in the paper, what I want you to do is to write an analysis, a brief summary of the case, the facts of the case. As you know, self-destruction. It can be a case from someone you know, or it can be someone in your network, or a case from media, right? Or a famous case even. Write a quick summary of the case. Then part 2, so number 1, summarize, right? Number 2, rule out as many of the 11 forms as possible. So you're basically a diagnostician, a physician possibly, criminologist, however you want to think about it, and your job is to eliminate as many of these as possible. So this is often the longest section of the paper, where you're walking through, say, 9 or 10 of these forms of suicide that didn't seem implicated in the case you're analyzing. You're explaining why. So briefly define what each of these 11 were, and then tell me, or tell yourself, why that particular case isn't makes no sense in terms of being altruistic or something. You should be able to sort of write out entire categories pretty quickly. Once that long section is done, then you've got a little bit shorter section where you are telling me which seem possible and why. So define the remaining forms of suicide that seem possible in your case and explain why that's the case. Number 4, I want a really quick summary of what you think. Take your best guess. If you were to say what it is, what was it? Once you have located, like let's say that you decide, I think the cause of my friend or the case that I analyzed was egoism, was Stoic egoism. Okay, I think that's what it is. What Durkheim has done, what this map does here, this diagram, is it tells us, if you look at the center of this as a kind of pivot point, go to the opposite corner. So if Stoic egoism is the cause of demise, what would have held that person in the world? Well, what might have held them in the world was altruism, because altruism is the countervailing force to egoism. It lies on the opposite end of the social bond of identification. Let's say you get somebody who seems to have specific anomie. What might have prevented their demise? Well, what's on the opposite end is fatalism, more regulation, taking away some of the freedom, re-regulating, bringing the desires down, bringing them back into alignment with the means to achieve them, something like that. If you have someone who's altruistic, they died because they were commanded to die. What would have kept them in the world? Well, maybe having individual taste or individual pleasures or individual self-reflection might have actually kept them in. And then the compound forms are located differently. So if you have ego anomie, both fatalism and altruism would have been a countervailing force. If you have ego altruism, that's that pole, either fatalism or anomie would have been a countervailing force. And then if you have anomic altruism, that's located here, then either egoism or fatalism would have been countervailing forces. So then kind of explain what that means. How would have more regulation or more individual self-definition help someone? Alternatively, how would have less regulation, more freedom, more ability to have expanded desires and so on, or more group time, more group identification have helped? Okay? And that would be the last part of the paper, number 5, just a really quick statement of what you think the countervailing forces could have been that might have held someone in the world. And with that, we're done. I hope you found this helpful. Again, probably not of interest to anyone who's not in the class.